Alright, so we've been talking a lot about the specific musical details of Javanese gamelan. But before we go any further, one thing that I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the philosophy behind this music, which, as you might have guessed, is extremely complex and deep, but I just wanted to go over a simple example of how exactly the practice of Javanese gamelan relates to the philosophical concepts behind it. So, one thing that you'll notice as we're learning a lot of these vocal parts, the text that we're actually using for the classical pieces in particular is actually Javanese poetry, and it's not specific to one piece. And what I mean by that is like the text that we learned for Wilujeng, Parabesang, etc. That text can actually be used for a wide variety of different pieces. It's used really often for different ladrang. Another thing is that the actual vocal melody are these kind of preset patterns based on those saleh notes. So even the vocal melodies themselves, you can find those exact same melodies in other pieces. So if another piece has the same saleh, it'll often use the same melodic pattern in the vocal melody. Now, when Western scholars were first studying Javanese gamelan, Mantelhood, who was a major figure in the beginning of the UCLA ethnomusicology program, he thought that the balongan, that skeletal melody, was actually the core melody, the primary melody of the piece, and everything else was based around that. But if you look at notation for the same piece from a variety of different Javanese musicians, you'll often find that the balongan itself actually has variations. So one person might write the balongan as being one particular way, whereas another player will actually have a different version of the same balongan. So it begs the question, what is the melody of this piece? How is this piece thought of by musicians? How are these parts created? How is the balongan created? How is the vocal melody thought of? Where is the melody, basically? Well, the answer, unfortunately, is not a simple one, but I'll say this. So essentially, Javanese gamelan is part of a much larger system of thinking. Now that system of thinking is called kejawen. Kejawen could basically be translated as the practice of being Javanese. So kejawen itself encompasses a cosmology, a way of ethics, an attitude towards social life, a belief system, as well as a spiritual practice. Basically, it's an all-encompassing system of philosophical and social thought. Now, within kejawen, there is a spiritual element that I referred to. That spiritual element is usually referred to as kebatinan. Now, kejawen itself, it reflects the wide variety of influences that are present in Javanese culture. So you have elements of animism, of nature worship, essentially. You have elements of Hinduism. You also have elements of Muslim beliefs, in particular Sufism. And all of these things kind of combine to create a essentially Javanese character. Now, for a lot of Javanese people, these things come intuitively. They are not things that are consciously understood, but they are understood based on their experience of living in this culture, in this world. Now, kebatinan itself is essentially about these two different elements, right? So we have these two different elements. The first is called lahir. Now, lahir, it refers to the external world, right? So it refers to material existence, yeah? Whereas batin refers to something akin to soul. It's something that is inner, that is hidden, that is truthful, that is beyond the material world. Now, in kebatinan, this is a form of dualism. So we have these two elements that make up the known universe, that make up everything. So in the practice of kebatinan, people are undergoing a variety of practices, including meditation, including study, including fasting. Now this is in the pursuit of moving beyond the lahir, the external characteristics of the world, to a deeper understanding of batin. So looking for an understanding of soul. Now, in Javanese gamelan, we could say that all of these things we've learned about a piece, the techniques that we have, the melodies that we know from each individual instrument, these are something like lahir. These are akin to physical details, material details about the piece. However, there's something deeper. Now, this is a concept which originally was written about by Pak Sumarsam, a scholar of Javanese music, and he wrote about this idea of Lagu Batin. So lagu just means melody. As such, Lagu Batin means something like inner melody or hidden melody. Now, this concept basically says that inside each piece of classical Javanese music, we actually have an inner secret melody which is guiding the entire piece. So the balongan is actually extracted. It's a skeletal version of this overall inner melody. All of the other pieces, all of the other instruments are playing elaborations on this inner melody in their own way. Now, a really interesting thing is that if you ask a particular Javanese musician to explain the inner melody for a given piece, again, you'll have different versions of it depending on who you talk to. What we end up finding is that Lagu Batin, this inner melody, different people have different ideas about it, but the true version of the piece only emerges when everyone plays together. So sometimes this Lagu Batin, this inner melody, is expressed in the rebab part. Sometimes it is expressed in the vocal part. Sometimes it is expressed in the gender part. And these things are different from one gending to the next. And only when all of the musicians meet together, when all of the musicians share their ideas with each other through careful listening, my instrument imitates this instrument, imitates this instrument, imitates the human voice. During this process, a truth emerges. Now, this truth, this inner melody, isn't expressible in words. It's not expressible in simple notation. Rather, it is something we feel. Now, this idea of feeling, this idea of using intuition, and more so in using this feeling of intuition and collaboration in pursuit of truth, is really at the core of Javanese ideology and Javanese spiritual practice. We find that community is actually necessary for the performance of this music. Shared understanding between one musician and the next is what actually produces the purest form of the piece. This Lagu Batin, this inexpressible melody, comes through in the collaboration of all of the pengrawit, all of the musicians listening to each other and performing together. Now, this idea of feeling, this idea of intuition in pursuit of truth, this is referred to by the Javanese word rasa. In Indonesian, that would be rasa, but in the Javanese term rasa carries a lot more weight, carries a lot more connotations along with it. Now, this word roughly means feeling or intuition, but even more so, it means a kind of sixth sense, a deep knowledge of something that goes beyond just a mental knowledge, right? So this is a intuitive, physical awareness of something. Now, rasa, this idea of intuition, is really important for accessing not only batin in the context of spiritual practice through meditation, but it's also really important in the practice of gamelan, karawitan. So in the practice of gamelan, each musician is expected to use rasa. And rasa, this feeling, this intuition, it goes far beyond knowing exactly what notes to play. Rather, it requires a deeper awareness. It requires a strong sense of feeling. It requires knowledge, of course. It requires you to know what these pieces are used for, in what context, which moments are important in the Lagu Batin, which moments are important in the composition to emphasize. And through this deep knowledge of lahir, through the use of rasa, of intuition, of this deep feeling, we gain a deeper knowledge, an inexpressible knowledge of what a particular piece, what a particular gending really means. So I just wanted to share a little bit about the philosophical aspects. But now moving forward, what I'd like to do is look at the vocal parts from some more modern pieces. Now with certain modern pieces, it's much more clear. It's much more clear that the vocal melody takes priority instead of this very complex hidden melody. That's just something I want you to think about as we go forward. But now I'd like to look at a couple pieces, one piece in particular by Kinarto Sabdo, who was a modern composer. So we're going to look at that, and these are more heavily based on the vocal melody. But that's something I'd like you to think about as we go forward and we learn more about Javanese classical music. And if you have questions about the Javanese philosophy surrounding this music, feel free to just let me know.